Okay, so we're going to get started on this last session. You could all get in your seats.
Who's the guy in the red shirt? He looks familiar. You know? He's a non-believer.
So this is our opportunity to have Q&A and interlocutor discussion. I think I'd like to start by just asking the panelists if any of them have a question for each other, and then we'll proceed to some questions from the audience. Go.
I found the presentations of the other guests fascinating. I especially liked the deconversion thing there, but I also liked the personal stories that John gave. So just a comment.
So Emily, could you there's a mic over there. I'm trying to run the show solo right now, so sorry. We need to get this on the mic. So maybe what we could do first is take your question, then they could repeat it.
Yeah. I'm just curious if, from the apologetic standpoint, from the Orthodox Mormon standpoint, if there's really a sense of how difficult these struggles are for people with respect to like a crisis of faith.
That's a really good question. That's an exceptional question. And the answer is, I should say the perception is that FAIR is the conservative, I'll put it as one person put it, strong arm of the church that's going to go there and force the issue down everybody's throat. The reality is we have a number of people with FAIR who have returned to the church, who were away and have come back. We have many members. In fact, I would say probably a majority of our members have family members who have left the church. And so I think that most of the FAIR-less members not only understand that, but really have a deep feeling for people who have left the church. Now, you don't see that on the message boards, which goes back to, on the message boards, you have a number of people who kind of hang around FAIR, but aren't FAIR volunteers. And so I see a number of names there on all the LDS message boards, and people kind of assume they're FAIR, because some of the FAIR people will talk with them and banter with them, but they're not the FAIR volunteers. I agree, it's very disheartening. I know that one of our board members and myself have both gone through periods of not doubting the church, but things have happened within the church that have been very painful and difficult for the family to go through. So, it's one of those, I feel for you. Sometimes it gets into the discussion, though, as who's read the most literature, or how, if you read the literature, how can you possibly believe, or how could you possibly not believe? And it gets into that argument. And the next argument is that comes up with, well, then you must be lying for the church or lying for the Lord or something, because if you read that, then you would know that it's not true, or you would know that it's true. You get that on both sides. It gets into one of my favorite gospel hobby horses, the blacks and the priesthood issue, where people on both sides have sinned, as we say. We have people who use that as a stick to beat the church with, who don't really care about the African Americans, who just want the stick to beat it with. And we have other members who pretend like nothing's ever happened and everything's fine, and say things that are painful to people. So, we both sinned. Anybody else on that?
No idea, but I do know that it's a recurring theme that the people going through these experiences do not feel understood. So, whether they are understood or whether people know what it's like to experience a crisis of faith, I don't know. But I do know that increasing sympathy and increasing open arms can go a long way to sort of help them feel that they're being understood, or that they're at least being listened to.
I had a methodological question for Rosmary. It was really interesting, the two groups that you identified online. And I'm wondering, I don't have a sense, but I'm wondering what your sense is of others who aren't participants in those communities and their experience. The ritualistic component of community that you identified is really fascinating. But I'm wondering if, is it your sense that there might be another group that doesn't participate, or do you feel like this kind of...
Absolutely,
they
and that
fall
was
into
actually,
those?
I'm glad you said that, because that reminded me of a question that I had for John, which had been, he identified who his sample was and how they obtained the sample by going through various websites that are for people who are already active online in that area. So, I mean, absolutely there are Mormons who are not interested, or former Mormons or questioning Mormons who are not interested in engaging in community online, either because they don't have the cultural capital to participate in those types of communities or because they're not interested. They don't have an axe to grind. They don't have issues of pain and resentment. I mean, full disclosure, my husband is a former Mormon, and he is not, he's not anywhere participating online. It's not part of his internal psychological needs to express that in that way.
My question is for John, and maybe a follow-up from Rosmary. And you're a social scientist. My dad was one of the first Mormon psychiatrists, and he used to say to me, for every complicated problem, there are at least 100 simple solutions, and they're all wrong. And I'm interested in how you'd separate in the data the other complicated issues of life that aren't connected with the church. You know, between the time you're 15 and 60, which I'm almost 60, the variables that obtain are manifestly, prolific. And so when we say the church this and the church that, and they're leaving because of this and that, and when there are financial issues, there are all kinds of things that make somebody's life troublesome. And then how they respond with their family or with the church, and what the church means to them, or how much time they can dedicate to the church, and so on and so forth, become more complex and complicated and compromised because of everything else that's going on in their lives and in their world. Is there a way to get reliable data that sort of parses that?
It's a great question, and it's something that I personally can easily lose sight of. I had a mother, a 28-year-old mother of 2 children. She had lost 3 children through miscarriages. She married at age 18, and she's the daughter of a current member of the Quorum of the 70. And she just internalized so much guilt and shame somehow in her LDS experience, which is not everyone's LDS experience, but it was hers, to the point where whenever she would come home from Relief Society, the extent to which she felt so inadequate and sorrowful at church led her to take out a razor blade and cut little gashes into her leg. And that was the only way that she felt that she could deal with the pain that she was experiencing at church. And for her, her only answer to keep herself from cutting was to stop going to church, which wasn't acceptable to her father, who's currently, again, in the Quorum of the 70. And it was very easy for me to just say the church is causing people to cut, and that's just not at all fair. Lots of people cut outside of Mormonism, and lots of ex-Mormons probably cut, and lots of, just take your pick. And so it's very easy for us to think that we can reduce things down to 1 or 2 factors, and we can't. With marriages, I think it's most easy to fall into that category, because I think all of us will agree that marriages at their best are very difficult. And so when a marriage fails, it's very easy to say that it was the church that causes it. And that's sometimes simply the field. Religion becomes the battlefield that the battle is waged on, but it's really not necessarily about religion at all. So I don't have a perfect answer for you other than to just concede your point, which is that these things are complicated. Life is messy in and outside of Mormonism, and we have to use caution to not be too reductive.
I mean, the only thing I would add to that is that as he was talking about that, I'm thinking of the corollary, which are the testimonies of the faithful Mormons. And in many cases that I talked to converts to the church, the reasons that they gave were different than what the testimonies I presented today. So a lot of converts will talk about converting for the social practices. They liked the church's social positions. Or they converted because they were interested in dating a Mormon. So I think that it cuts both ways. We certainly can't know every factor, and I don't think individuals can know every factor that contributes to decisions to leave a faith. But we also can't know the other side of the coin. I think that's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about identity and how it's shaped.
Kind of a random thought, not related to the questions, but John just reminded me of something. As I'm currently talking with a woman online whose husband has left the church and is a good man, and she's struggling with it. And what do I do? And should I divorce him, or what should I do? And I'm strongly encouraging her to stay in her marriage and to try and find things they can work on and go to counseling and do whatever they can do, because he's a good man and such. But the difficulty he has, and it came up when you had it, what she has is he's become an evangelist. Where he's so strongly that you have to leave the church, your kids have to leave the church, everything, and she's fine with saying, just let me go, just let me continue on. And she says, I can't let you continue on something that's not truthful. And so the only out that she sees at this point is divorce. And so so I'm encouraging, go to counseling, get something else, because obviously there's got to be some middle ground somewhere. Go ahead.
I was going to add one quick thing. I'm sorry. I just thought of something else. I'm in my third year of a clinical psychology PhD, and I work at the Utah State University Counseling Center. And while I think it's careful not to be too reductive, I'm gonna now play the opposite side and say that 4 out of the 5 clients that I'm currently seeing right now are male university students, returned missionaries, and they call themselves addicts. They speak about their lives in terms of being sober, sobriety. They're members of a 12-step group, and the main reason that they came to psychotherapy is because they occasionally masturbate. One of them masturbates about once every 3 weeks, but he's had his temple recommend taken away. He's no longer able to take the sacrament, so when his parents came to visit him, in his student ward, they noticed that he wasn't taking the sacrament. And, these young men are experiencing a great deal of shame and guilt over how somehow they've internalized and processed conversations about masturbation and pornography. And I think there are things that we might do culturally that really do have direct impacts. And so while we don't want to be too reductive, I don't think we want to turn a blind eye to maybe some of the ways we have conversations that really do have direct impacts on people.
I just have a quick question for John. It's actually a little two-pronged question, if I could. People often study the same facts or issues and come to vastly different conclusions. Some have their faith strengthened, while others have their faith destroyed by the same information. To what do you attribute this difference in outcome, and why do you feel that the stories of those who have suffered a negative outcome should be privileged over those with a positive outcome?
Well, when you say negative and positive, what do you mean?
Destroyed faith, enhanced faith.
Okay. That's a really hard question for me to answer, because I'm one of the ones who has lost faith, and so my perspective is going to be really biased. What I can say is that to some degree, disbelief appears to be a luxury. If and we even saw this a little bit in our data, the more income you have, the more freedom you feel to question and to be honest with parents and siblings and children, etc. And you can just imagine that if you're financially independent and you don't have to worry about losing your job, and you don't have to worry about being written out of an inheritance, you might feel the freedom to inquire without reservation a little bit more than somebody who's got a job that may be associated with the church and who needs that inheritance and who can't afford to sever social ties that the church might benefit them from. And so I also think that, if we were to do sort of a multifactorial analysis, what is the person's spouse like? Are they open-minded, or are they kind of rigid and harsh and dogmatic? That might be a factor in whether someone's willing to really look honestly at the data. And what happens when they look honestly is a totally separate question. But I think there are factors in one's environment that are going to make it more or less likely that they can actually look objectively at the data. Other factors might include, if you're, just imagine if you're making $30,000 a year, struggling to raise your kids, maybe you're a single mom, and your ward is just this critical social support for you, and you enjoy it, your interests in actually looking at the data objectively are going to be very different. So, I think that those are sort of the barriers to just being able to look at things objectively. And I guess, Scott, I'll just refer a tiny bit to something you mentioned in your talk. You were kind of asking about the differences between apologists and apostates. But I do think that when we're raised as Mormons, and we're raised from 2 years old to say that I know this church is true, we're programmed for belief. And if you don't believe me, just look at the fact that 99.9% of the world's population wasn't raised Mormon, and they don't happen to believe the same things we do. Belief is very much something that you most often inherit from your family, and then it gets ingrained in you. And so it's very hard to step back and actually look at the church and say, is it really true? And I think one of the differences between maybe the critics or apostates and apologists is that apologists sort of start from the decision that the church is true, and then they kind of figure out how to defend it at any cost, and I don't want to say by any means necessary. And Scott, I shouldn't speak for you, so you can tell me if I'm mischaracterizing apologists, but I've never heard, I don't hear apologists often. I've never seen Grant, Palmer interviewed on the Fair, podcast. I've never seen, Michael Quinn interviewed on the Fair podcast. I think that, I've never heard the Fair podcast interview a homosexual who tried reparative therapy and it failed. And it just doesn't feel like there's an attempt to really objectively balance the issues. I just think that's not the mission of Fair. But someone who has some reason to actually start questioning, and ultimately they become apostates, I think those people say, I'm willing to balance the evidence and go where the evidence lies. And I do think that's a difference. And I think all sorts of life experiences shock us into being willing to look objectively.
Yeah. I was with you until you said at any cost, and then I went like, no. Obviously, there are difficult things within any faith community. I think we heard about that this morning, about how the Brother Faulkner, he commented that no matter, if you look at history, there's going to be messy things in there, and anytime you have human beings involved in any endeavor, it's going to be messy. There's a great quote by Gordon B. Hinckley that talks about how if we look back in our past and we start criticizing the individuals involved, then there's a lot to criticize. But how much more amazing it is the church came out of that environment where we had so many people with so many weaknesses. I've read Grant Palmer's book, and that's why he's not on the Fair podcast. So, we have historians that come in, and we have other people who deal with those same issues, the same issues that Grant deals with, but just not. But we just feel that they have a better, more. Let me phrase this: they have a more scholarly approach to it. So that would be the difference. Is probably one group looks at us as being polemic and being biased, where we look at it and we say we're trying to get the most objective view out there, and so we want to get the scholars who deal with with the primary source documents and people who have training and scholarship and such when we can. Now, we do mix it up, where we do also have other people who are hobbyists and such who also speak. But yeah, if he were to speak, he would be, well, anyway, yeah.
So you're saying fair seeks objectivity?
Yes. Yes. I know, disbelief. See? Picture disbelief.
But you did say in your statement or your mission statement that you start from a faithful position. I mean, you start there.
Yes,
You
absolutely.
don't end there.
Well, it's not objective to start from a position of disbelief either. What we have is both sides have biases. Everyone has a bias. Every researcher has a bias. Every scholar has a bias. And you have to understand your bias, and we're upfront about our bias. Our bias is we're believing members of the church. That's our bias. And so anything you read from us, you have to understand that as you read the conclusions of anything we write, that this is written by a believing member of the church. Now, when you're reading the facts of what we write, we try to get the facts from every place we can. We go back into the archives, we go into the various books, we look at the positives, the negatives, we look at all that, and we try and put all of the facts out there so that anybody reading it they can make their own decisions based on what those facts are. The conclusions, yes, they're ours, and they have the bias, whatever it is. But then again, it also goes into who is fair, and the assumption is fair is that I hear often is fair is the very conservative, the parents who do terrible things to their children when they leave, the families that ostracize people. That's the assumption of fair, and that's not us. We have liberals in our group. We have conservatives in our group. We have ex-Mormons who've returned in our group. We have a number of people who've gone through a number of different life experiences, and if someone shows up and tries to and so we have a variety, and when someone starts to espouse one of those more dogmatic positions, they're pretty quickly shouted down on our fair volunteer list because we have that variety of background. Anyway, I know people don't believe what I'm saying here because it doesn't fit within our what was the term that was used earlier this morning? Our glyph. It doesn't fit within our glyph.
All right. Mormonism isn't the only faith dealing with disillusion and disaffection, and it's not the only faith doing apologetics. So my question is in what you've seen and done, and maybe Mary, you can definitely add to this as well. How Mormons responded to disaffection, or have dealt with it, or done apologetics, especially in light of the internet age? How does it differ from, or does it differ at all from how other religions are dealing with these things?
I think there are characteristics of Mormonism that make it very compelling and maybe more illustrative example of these kind of dynamics of the potential things that can happen during faith crises. And these characteristics range from sort of the all-encompassing Mormons give so much of their time and their life, and they commit fully, or they're expected to. They serve callings and they serve missions, and these are volunteer positions, and they attend church, and they're required to make sacrifices in their lives that may differ from some other religious groups. So they're highly invested when they get to these points. At least the people that I've spoken with, they all invested a lot. And it also has the characteristic of literality, teaching that something is historical and true, and that there is archaeological evidence, and that there's linguistic evidence and DNA evidence for something. That's a little different than most Protestant or Catholic or any other group, and it has to do with the youth that Joanna mentioned of the church. It's a young church, so it's easier to sort of look at some of those things with a critical eye because the evidence for some of those things might be there. And people can look at those types of things and come to very different conclusions, obviously. Those things are cited as reasons why the church is true and reasons why the church is false. But I think some of those characteristics of the church are just not the same for other more established faiths. And also the church, because its difference and competitiveness with other branches of Protestant Christianity make it a target in the media so much more than other faiths, and in this particular moment. So it's a compelling moment to study that identity shift because all these factors are sort of converging.
I think we haven't done a good job, quite honestly, and I think that there are questions that come up. John articulated them quite well in his study, the various questions that came up. The gentleman asked me about the Book of Abraham earlier. There are other issues that, over the years with FAIR, as we do our conferences each year, we try and think of things that are troubling to people and try and find people who can address those issues and bring up or do research in it or address it somehow. And there are still issues out there that there's not a lot of what I would call good apologetics. And by good apologetics, I would define that not necessarily as the most persuasive, but as where someone has actually gone through and done good research and gotten good information that people can look at and do scholarly work on and such.
Hi, thanks for your presentations. And I one of the things I appreciated about this panel is the sense of there are people out there who are hurting, and that it's important for us to show compassion and kindness. I think that should be our number one takeaway. John, I was wondering if you have a sense from your study of the guilt and shame and hurt that people feel. Do you have a sense, or is there any way to measure how much of it is because of pressures they feel from God, from heaven, from this is affecting my standing in the eternities versus a more horizontal, this is about my relationships in my community, like you said, the single mother, what am I going to do about money and things like that? Or is it all kind of mixed up together because of the way the Mormons connect community to heaven?
One particularly stark finding from our data is that something like 55% of those who lose their faith in the church become either agnostic or atheist. And I'm curious to know whether other faith traditions have such a casualty rate in terms of belief in God. And so I think there's one of the most difficult things that people experience is the attempt to try and take their external locus of control, which is sort of God and their priesthood leaders and sort of the rules of Mormonism, and figure out a way to sort of redirect that to an internal locus of control where they get to decide what's meaningful or worthwhile or important to them. And that's a really hard process. You just see these people who are like, I want to break away. I may want to try a cup of coffee. I may want to not go to church on Sunday. But there's this training, this programming that's so ingrained that they are constantly questioning themselves and constantly doubting whether they have the ability to discern what is right for them without an ensign reference or, a general conference talk that they can use as guidance. And so there is a lot of self-doubt and shame early in the process. But I think for a lot of these people, the more they study and the more they sort of get a big picture, they realize just a lot of their beliefs fall to the floor. And at that point, when everything's fallen to the floor, then you can decide what you want to pick back up again. And then it absolutely no longer is a matter of God and divinity, because either you reinterpret your view of God as something that will only be loving and kind, or you jettison the idea of God altogether. But very few of these people maintain a stern, judgmental type of God in the end of their process. And so then it very much becomes, what's the social collateral damage of honesty and openness?
John mentioned in your presentation that Marlon Jensen said that this is a season of apostasy. Is there any sense of what that means in terms of real numbers, or any speculation what that means in terms of real numbers? And I think he also mentioned in that same discussion that the church was working on some sort of program or modification of curriculum to try to address that. Any feel for what form that will take?
We've actually, on Mormon Stories, we've done 2 recent episodes on demographics in the church. And something that's very clear is a few things that are really clear. Number one, the number of people we claim in the 14 million number, the national censuses, I don't know what the plural is for census, across many, many countries show that the number of people who identify as Mormon is very different from the number we claim on our rolls. And most of the professional, demographers, is that a word that I'm familiar with, sort of put the activity rates in the church at about 1/3. So 33% of all people who've been baptized are actually attending church. About 1/3, we don't even know who they are or where they are. They're just on the rolls, but they maybe got baptized when they were 8 and never showed up at church again. And I think if there's some podcasts I've done on, the church in Chile and in Guatemala and in other places, you'll find activity rates in third world countries around sometimes 15%, sometimes 20%. And in the United States, demographers are saying that sort of growth in the U.S. is either flatlined or is starting to decline. And in the Western world, it's definitely, and in Asia, it's definitely on the decline. And so I think Elder Jensen was right and had it accurate. I've been able to meet with a few general authorities who have confirmed this is a problem. And there definitely are attempts to figure out how to address these issues, but these general authorities that I've talked to who have asked that their names not be mentioned, I'm not trying to quote some fictitious person, but it's very hard to make positive change in the church. Even if you're an apostle, I've been told that doesn't mean that you just kind of get to say what's going to happen or what's not going to happen. Change can be very slow and very methodical. So getting, the history department and the curriculum department and the correlation department and CES all on board, and then to get, the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 to get unanimous consent on some type of significant change can sometimes take decades. And I think that's why some of the social issues that the church has been a little bit late to the party on addressing has taken sometimes so long. And so I think they are making attempts, but I think they're going to be complicated because these general authorities that I've talked to, when I've asked them about Book of Abraham or polyandry, they don't have good answers. And so what do? Do you introduce these? Do you sort of try and placate the 2 or 3% of your membership to sort of make them feel better and risk exposing or infecting the other, 95% of your active membership to these problems when you don't have a good answer? I think what you do in that situation is exactly what they're doing, which is you try not to talk about it too much and maybe get some specialized pockets of people like Fair and Maxwell that will try and address these things in a sort of quiet, behind-the-scenes way. But as soon as you sort of open it up, it's just a Pandora's box and you're inviting your own demise.
Yeah, John brings up a couple of very good points there. The one thing I think is interesting when you talk about activity rates, though, we have an interesting. One person said to me the other day that all politics is local politics, and the same is true in Mormonism. All Mormonism is local Mormonism, and what that means is we sometimes take our own. We look so hard within ourselves, and we become myopic about. We think of ourselves as being somehow special or different than everybody else. And you say, well, that's a good thing. That's church teaches you to do that. But I'm talking about things like activity rates and such. Other churches also have similar activity rates we have, where people join and then fall away. There's lots of transitions with various churches. Now, the LDS church has more of a problem than some because we have such high demands on our membership. You can't smoke, can't drink, don't do coffee, tithing. Time commitment. There's quite a time commitment for being a Mormon, and so it's it is more difficult being a Mormon than being, say, Presbyterian or some of the other faiths out there, some of the other denominations out there. So that leads to the inactivity rate, or probably a little higher than some. We have to recognize that, as one person said, that the problems that we deal with, everybody else deals with too. One of the differences is we tend to hyper-focus on it. If you talk to your average Baptist and you ask them about his church history or her church history, you'll have some difficulties. I had difficulties going to the Southern Baptist libraries and trying to get information from them and such, because Mormons do such a great job of documenting everything, and that's not the case in some other faith traditions. The librarians are very helpful, but they just don't have the information all documented like we do. We wrote everything down. And so as we look at our faith tradition, we say, isn't that terrible? Isn't that awful what happened in the 1950s or the 1850s or the 1840s? And very similar things happen in other faith traditions as well, but it's not part of their discussions. It's not part of their community discussion that's going on, or their internet discussions. They just kind of walk past it and don't even think about it. And if you ask them about it, they probably won't know.
Thanks, everyone, for being here today. This is really eye-opening. A question I have, my faith had its origins in a very polemic environment. Faith crisis brought me into the church, and many crises along the way. I want to ask this question. How much of these faith crises, the pain that they seem to generate, do you think is attributed to a lack of transparency, to just information blindsiding people? For Family Home Evening, our family, we're now studying who the wives of Joseph Smith were and who the husbands of those wives were. I don't want my kids to grow up having a one-sided faith. And so my question is, how much is attributable to being blindsided?
I mean, universally, in the cases that I study, it was always a case of information that they hadn't known before, or an event that happened. So, but that, I think, is what differentiated the pathos that I talked about from the escapist, was that the pathos, it tended to be an event, something happened, whereas the escapist, it was information that they felt had been withheld. And I mean, maybe it was withheld, maybe it wasn't transparent. I guess those are two different ways of saying the same thing. In these cases where people may not have the resources to find some of these well-hidden things in church history. So I think it depends on the outcome, but in the case of people that left that I studied, it was across the board exactly what you're saying.
I think, Scott, the part of your presentation where I got most emotionally activated was when you were listing all the different instances where the church has mentioned the peepstones or the.
I said that. I told her there's one part of my presentation that's going to be a hot button, so that was it. Okay, good.
It's true. It's true that the church has talked in the ensign about, I guess, Joseph's plural wives and the peepstones in the translation. But I think it's also true that every single time the church has visually depicted the translation process for the Book of Mormon, they have never, that I've ever seen, depicted it visually as the data show it actually happened. Richard Bushman himself has said this is a really bad thing, and I think it is deceptive. I think they know how the translation happened because they published it, yet they don't visually represent it that way, and they continue to mislead people. And as far as polygamy goes, Joseph Smith's polygamy, how many of you have ever heard mention of one of Joseph's plural wives in sacrament meetings, Sunday school, Relief Society, seminary, institute, BYU religion classes? How many of you have heard it? So the people from Farron Farms raised their hand, and nobody else. And we're all lifelong members of the church, 30, 40, 50 years in it. And so the church could fix this problem. And putting it in an obscure article here or there, I think, is very different from the complete honesty that we're taught to maintain as members of the church. Honesty isn't sort of hiding things or mentioning them somewhere obscure. It's saying, here's the full truth, here's the complete truth, and let's talk about it. As I understand it, in the Brigham Young manual, the priesthood manual, they actually changed the text where Brigham Young would refer to his wives, and they actually changed his own original words to say wife.
Put in brackets.
Right. And so this is a position, this is an apologetic position that is just really frustrating, because I feel that the right answer is to say, we need to do better. We need to be more honest as a church. We need to be more open. People deserve to know. If you're a convert, if you're investigating the church, you deserve to know that Joseph had 32 wives, that 8 of them were married to other men, and that several of them were teenagers. You deserve to know that, because that speaks to the character and the credibility of the person that you're being asked to believe in. You deserve to know that if you're being taught the Book of Abraham or the Pearl of Great Price, that the manuscript or the scroll that it was based on actually, by all Egyptologists' account, bears no resemblance to the actual text. And if you're black, you absolutely deserve to know before you're baptized that the church called you dark and loathsome for about 150 years before they decided to let you in and have full fellowship. I just think that's just honest. And I think we should admit that. And I feel sorry for apologists, and I'm saying this sincerely. I feel sorry for them that they have to do the speaking for the church. You guys may not feel sorry for yourselves, but I think you're in a very hard position. It's almost like the spouse of an abusive husband who has to make excuses for the husband's behavior. I feel sorry that you have to do that. I wish that the people who were in charge were explaining their actions and behaviors and weren't relying on you to do it at arm's length. And I mean that with affection.
Thank you. I think that's interesting, because I agree with John on the artwork completely. That the art we have in the early book, in the Book of Mormons, we had the Blue Books of Mormon, or Book of Mormons, however you want to say it, right? That it did not show the way that it was written. It was an artist rendition. The difference is I look at that and say, look at that artist rendition that's not accurate based on what's written in all the church documents. John looks at that and says, look how deceptive the church is being. And they publish the inside. But the question is how many pieces of artwork do the general authorities make? 0. They don't paint. We have.
But could they commission?
But they didn't even commission the ones that are there. They didn't even commission those ones. Those are ones that an artist made, and then the church bought it from them, clearly. But yes, legacy. Wait for the microphone. There we go.
The film Legacy seems to feature the plates right in front of Smith.
Yes, it does. And that was done by, again, a filmmaker who my thought was he got it wrong.
I just wonder how many converts have access to those articles from the 70s before they make their choice to join the church.
Well, there again, it goes back to his other comment about Brigham Young. And yes, they did take the word wives out and put wife in and put it in brackets. And I disagree with doing that. But you have to go back to, why is the manual there? Is the manual there to teach history? Is the manual there to talk about polygamy? No, the manual's there to teach about how husbands should treat their wife. And the issue the church has to deal with is we have some crazies out there, and I'll say that, crazies, I'll use that word, I'll get beat up for it later, that will take that as some sort of permission to go out and do what the church doesn't want them to do, is go back and say, hey, let's talk about wives again, let's talk about polygamy again. As far as the blacks issue, that one's off the table for me completely. Because if you say, well, golly, the church needs to talk about how badly they mistreated blacks, let's talk about what Billy Graham said about blacks. It was bad. Let's talk about what other church leaders said about blacks. Let's talk, it wasn't a mob of angry Mormons in Little Rock keeping those 9 children from going there. That's the question. I mean, that's the issue, is you say, our argument is, as apologists, gee, we're just as good as everybody else. That's not a very good position. But it's no worse than other positions, and to sort of use that as a stick when you don't care about the African Americans, all you care about is using it as a stick to beat up black or beat up the church. To me, I think that's disingenuous. Anyway.
I don't think I've ever met a person that didn't care about the blacks, first of all. personally. I mean, I'm not a credible person in my experience. But this argument that the church isn't the place to learn history, if you look at the way I kind of see it is that the church leaders use history when it suits their purpose. And sometimes they don't always use it honestly. So the classic case is the one about Thomas B. Marsh. We've all heard that Thomas B. Marsh left the church over the fact that his wife got in some dispute over the milk strippings. And if anybody has actually read the actual history, Thomas Marsh left for some very credible reasons that related to violence that was being perpetrated on a certain town, as I understand it, in Missouri. But when the church tells that story, they'll use history, even wrongly, if they think that it's going to suit their purpose. And so I don't think it's fair to say that the church isn't a place to learn history when history is used to one's advantage when it's convenient.
I agree. The Thomas Marsh story shouldn't be used anymore. But I think what happens is you have human beings that are looking at stories and such, and they're putting together their talks, and they're saying, this is a great story, and they may have learned it that way, and it's wrong. And I'm hoping they don't use it anymore.
If it's all right, I'm going to change course a little bit in the name of agreeing to disagree, maybe. I've made a simple observation, and that's all it is. I have nothing to back it. But as I'm observing the dynamics in my own family and the dynamics of those I interact with, both at church and now outside of the church, I'm noticing, at least I think I'm noticing, some sort of a trend in that those that are becoming disaffected or feeling that the church might not be true tend to be, at the very least, interested in the social sciences, if not having a background in the social sciences. And those that tend to maybe stay or want to stay or participate in apologetics, they tend to not have that same background. And again, this is a simple observation. I have no evidence to back it. I would ask the panel if you agree with that observation. And if you do you think that's causation, correlation, neither? Just looking for some discussion on that topic.
I think there's a recent study that showed the number one major where people left the church was English, that I could have guessed that.
Where is that study?
I read that in a newspaper article. It must have been either 2 or 3 years ago. I don't remember the study, but I think there's correlation. I think you have some self-selection going on.
That explains my student evaluations.
Could be. I don't know.
I have the same theory. Humanities and social sciences can be more associated with disaffection than, let's say, engineering.
So causation, correlation?
Correlation.
I did notice, I don't really have anything to say about that, but I did notice when I visited Mormon Scholars Testify that there's a whole bunch of Mormon academics on that site, but there are very, very few in the humanities. So there's a correlation for you too. I don't know what it means. There's a few in the corner, but other than that.
There are a lot of hidden Mormon feminists.
Yeah. Hidden.
Psychology graduate here who had the pleasure of last week telling one of my close mission friends that I no longer believe in the church. And he asked me in our conversation if I was anti-Mormon now. And I didn't really know how to answer that. I participate in a variety of online communities. Some of them, the escapist, probably more than the pathist. In my discussion on the community, we kind of discussed this term, anti-Mormon, and a lot of us don't really like it. I think an artifact that many ex-Mormons bring from their experience in Mormonism is this deep desire to be understood by others. And we want our Mormon friends to understand where we're coming from. we kind of find that in my discussion online that anti-Mormon is a very loaded term, it feels. Seems like maybe it comes from, one person suggested the term anti-Semitism, which, from, I think, a general understanding is like a hatred of everything, Semite, from the Semite tradition, from Jewish tradition, including the people themselves, when we think of the Holocaust. And in my experience, and many others I've spoken with, none of the ex-Mormons hate in the strongest sense of that word, which I think is a very strong word. None of us hate Mormons at all. We dislike many of the things behaviors perhaps and culture, but we do not hate. So I guess we've heard that term a couple times today, anti-Mormon. I'm curious to get to the question, how do you define it? So the whole panel, or do you define that term? What can we use to define, who is an anti-Mormon and who's just an ex-Mormon? When I start saying things, when I become an evangelist of, ex-Mormonism, I still have trouble with that term even. When do I become an anti-Mormon?
So I have a chapter in my dissertation that I'm hoping to write on former Mormons, and I'm sort of grappling with that myself, whether that's a term imposed on a group against their will, whether it's a fair term at all. And the reason that I tend to think it's not a fair term at all is because if I were to issue a call for interviews and I requested anti-Mormons to participate, no one would respond to that. That's not a group of people that identify. I mean, there's no such thing as people who identify that way. There are people who are passionate, and there are people who are vitriolic, and there are people who are very angry, and there are internet trolls, which is a whole other thing because they troll everywhere, not just in certain places. But I don't think I would find anybody willing to do an interview that self-identifies as anti-Mormon. So I mean, personally, I don't find that concept useful, except when it speaks to the identity of Mormons themselves, which is a very fraught identity that's filled with the passive feeling like they themselves are being targeted and they themselves are outsiders. And so the term anti-Mormon sort of communicates some of that feeling of a threat to their identity as Mormons because others are out to get them with their literature and their hate and their anger towards us for being different. So, I mean, it's useful when you think of it as a term that reflects back on the creators of the term more so than I think a specific demographic group that's out there somewhere.
And I'd just add that the use of the word cult to describe the church is probably equally offensive on the other side of that equation for believers. And I kind of think of both cult and anti-Mormon as the N-words within Mormonism. I don't think they deserve thoughtful consideration at all as being credible terms to be used.
I'm going to be a minority position here, I know. First of all, I know there are critics of the church, and I have no problem with critics of the church. I have no problem with people disagreeing with the church. I'm sure my esteemed panelist here doesn't agree with everything the church does. She's not a member, and I know that John doesn't agree with everything the church does. So you have critics. But when people start calling me a liar, when people say I'm engaging in lying for the Lord, I hear that constantly, over and over and over again. When I hear people saying the church is purposely going down a path of deception, I call them anti-Mormons because they are going on a path that is polemic, that is just very negative toward the church. Now, can someone disagree with the church? Absolutely. Do you disagree with the gay rights things, Prop 8? Sure. Are you an anti-Mormon for doing that? Absolutely not. But if you go on a systematic, the internet trolls, for example, and such, where the church can do no right and everybody who's outside the church can do no wrong, and no church historian is a good historian, but every church historian outside the church is a great historian, I call them anti-Mormon.
I just wonder if it might be more accurate and constructive to call them hurt or in pain.
No.
I just had a question in regards to some of that. I don't understand where there is any place in the church for spin doctoring. The church asks on temple recommend interviews if you are honest in all your dealings. One of the problems that I had was I found information. I didn't automatically go to anti-sources, but going to church sources, I found information that made it very clear to me that the church had not been open and honest in all its dealings with me. Yet it expected that from me, but it was not exhibiting that same behavior. I have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with expressing that sentiment, but I don't think that makes me anti-Mormon because I'm not the one who lied. I didn't lie. How does that how do you reconcile that?
See, I wanted also, with my no comment, I know it was a little bit flippant because I know there are people who are hurt who I would not call anti-Mormon. People who are lots of ex-Mormons I would not call anti-Mormon. To me, the difference is those who actively campaign against the church, they're anti-Mormon. In your case, there again, the church lied. I'd have to talk to you. Who lied? Are we talking about frequently it's say, no, I don't, is it your bishop lied or your stake president lied or, so. Yeah, see, the Book of Abraham's interesting because and I would disagree with you because there's things in the Book of Abraham that Joseph Smith couldn't have known, and there's positive apologetics for the Book of Abraham as well. There's negative apologetic for the Book of Abraham. In other words, there are two sides on that. There are two different sides, and so to just claim one side and say the other side's lying is not really very productive and very helpful.
I'm a social constructivist, so I believe religion is a social construct. And I'm wondering if part of this discussion that has to do with the anti versus devout, the church versus the individual, it seems to me that a lot of these bifurcations are artificial, and yet those are kind of self-instilled by the emphasis on the structure within the church itself, right, where there is emphasis on hierarchy and order and structure. And so people get caught up in the idea of the institution being this sort of overarching source of truth. Yeah. Whereas in the early church, it seems to me, based on what I've read, that wasn't the tradition. There was a lot more bottom up. There was a lot more room for debate and disagreement, which is a lot like other Christian churches. Baptist churches, you can go to one Baptist church and hear one thing. You go to another Baptist church and the preacher will have a different point of view. So the emphasis isn't on the church as an institution and a structure, but it's more as a church in terms of as a body of believers who sometimes vary in their belief systems and yet still feel part of the same group. How do you think the church has kind of done that, or how do you think that maybe the church or members of the church can get past that bifurcation of being either all in, right, or absolutely true or absolutely right in everything, versus being allowed the ability to learn about Joseph Smith and the other wives, to learn about these other factors without undermining the credibility of the overall spirit of the church?
Either want to take that or?
I don't know if this will come across as humorous or as interesting as it was for me, but when I was having lunch with one of the general authorities in the church, he made the comment to me, "Who are the brethren?" I don't know who they're talking about when they say the brethren, because from his point of view, it was not a monolithic, unified body of people operating as automatons in a unified direction. Now that's the public face that for probably some very good organizational reasons that they put forward, but he made it very clear to me very specific differences he had with very specific colleagues of his, and it was clear that his job might be just about as frustrating as anyone's to try and make positive progress from within. And then a different general authority that I spoke with told me about a conflict that he had with another person whose name you'd know. And it was very clear then too that there was just lots of people trying to do their best from their own perspective. And I think your point is very well taken, very well articulated.
I definitely agree with John on that one. So I think that there are 12 brethren in the Quorum of the 12 plus the First Presidency. And I think if you go in there on pretty much any issue, you'll find 12 different opinions on it. We saw that. In fact, I was quite surprised with your survey when it talked about people left over science. And my thought was, science? What science? The church has a statement that they have no position on science or on evolution or whatever it is. And yet I continue to see, I left the church because of the evolution issue. It's like, no, there is no position on evolution inside the LDS Church. Although there are many members, bishops, stake presidents, probably mission presidents, who do have positions on evolution and then forward that as if it's the church doctrine. As you know, if you go to the temple, you'll learn that, you know, certain things about evolution aren't true. And it's like, well, no, the church has specifically said there is no position on evolution. So, yeah, what is the church? Church is a collection of individuals with differing opinions. Yeah, being the son of a biologist, of course, evolution is something that came up a lot in my family. You know, as again, quoting my father on something else, he used to say, you can believe anything you want in the church. You just can't teach it. So. What that means...
Spiral of silence.
What that means is that there's a great latitude of belief that you're allowed to be a member of the church. You're allowed to believe a number of things. You could even believe that the Book of Mormon is not literal and still be a good, strong member of the church if you want to. But if you're teaching other people, then there's a doctrinal, you know, well, you teach out of the lesson manuals. You teach what the lesson manuals say, which is things that help build people up, inspire people, bring the Spirit in. Those are the things they teach. Things that try to, you know, be more honest, be more open, you know, those types of things. But as far as personal beliefs, you can believe anything. Pretty much, almost.
And it's a very painful place to be where you can't express how you really feel about something. Okay. And that's a problem if they say, you know, pay the tithing, obey what we say, believe whatever you want, but just be quiet about it. There's something very invalidating and hard about walking that road. The other thing I'll say is that when it comes to science, part of the complexity is that the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 are all sustained as prophets, seers, and revelators. So when they write a book like Man, His Origin and Destiny, or when they make public statements, or they publish Doctrines of Salvation that's distributed in church bookstores or in the church distribution system, what are members to do who aren't caught up in this sophistication that we're all, or alleged sophistication that we're all sort of caught up in? They're left to believe what Joseph Fielding Smith said because he was a prophet. And if the church would do us the favor of reminding us that just because a prophet, seer, or revelator says something, we don't have to believe it, I think that would take a lot of the pressure off. But because they don't happen to ever mention that, then it becomes a little bit more understandable why members would see the scientific issues as a problem, because they simply believe the prophets, seers, and revelators at their word.
You've been fiercely writing over there. No, and you know, it is interesting how things get propagated, because we have that series, and yet at the time, you know, that was one of the issues. Again, they had two apostles that debated the issue of evolution, and I remember at UVU they had a big, or not, at Utah State University. Gosh, I get my universities mixed up. Sorry. I know they had an issue where one of the apostles was not treated well because he came in and people were holding up the man's origin or destiny, saying, you know, are you being a true apostle? Are you, you know, doing what you should be doing? We do have to have. I think a lot of it comes down to when you talk about critic or apologist. a lot of it does come down to mindset. What is the church, and how monolithic is the church? And if you view the church as a monolithic, it's always right, every person who speaks is always right, every book that's always written is always right, I can pretty well guarantee you're not going to be in the church a long time, because there's differing opinions, and if you happen to pick up the wrong differing opinion, then it's going to be a problem for you.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Sure.
How would you suggest as an apologist, and I'm not
Yeah,
saying
it's fine.
this
Wait for the microphone. Wait for the microphone.
I'm not meaning this critically, I'm meaning this sincerely. As an apologist, how would you then, on your website, explain to a member of the church who wants to hold a temple recommend, for example, who believes in the temple and it's important to them and their family, how would you tell them to interpret the question of sustaining leaders as prophets, seers, and revelators, given the fact that you know and understand, and again, this is not intended to be critical, but you understand that they don't all speak as seers and prophets and revelators. In fact, I do remember doing a search in the standard works of the LDS Church and found nowhere reference to anyone being a prophet but the prophet. And so I'm not sure when that transition occurred in the church's history, but I'm just curious how you would tell members of the church who are struggling with questions about things like that to go about answering that question.
I think that Joseph Smith said it well, that prophet is a prophet only when acting as such. And Brigham Young went on to say that there's not a single revelation, I know I can't quote him now off the top of my head, but it's in paraphrasing, that the revelations we get, that we understand correctly, the revelations we get, we don't always even understand and don't communicate them properly, is kind of the paraphrasing of what I interpret the meaning of what he said. I think that we have to look at what the general authorities try and be very careful these days. They try to say things that are helpful for our salvation, are helpful for our lives, have to do with how we should live and practice the orthopraxy, as they say. Go to church, pay your tithing, don't do these things, do these things. So I've noticed the church has recently tried to narrow its conversations more to things that are gospel-oriented. But those things that are not strictly along the lines of salvation and such, they are free to speculate in. And, which football team's going to win, obviously nobody would say, gee, that was the prophet speaking, or that was the apostle speaking, therefore I must believe. And so you get to where is that line, as they speak, where's the line where I must believe it or I must not believe it. And I think that, the other thing you have to look at is the church believes in continuing revelation. And continuing revelation means the church learns and grows as well. And I think what we do is we often go back to the evangelical fundamentalist viewpoint, that if you go back far enough, you're going back to the original source documents of the Bible, you find the truth. So you have to always look back. And in the LDS church, we have too many members that do that, where we say we have to look back, when really we're trying to go forward and cast off our old things that we didn't know. We're trying to grow and learn from it and move forward. And so I think what we have to do is focus on the recent comments, the more recent comments, and give more weight to those than the older comments. And I think it's just the opposite we tend to do.
Is that only if they've been sustained as doctrinal? I mean, this whole process is bizarre to me as someone who was not raised. So I'm sure I'm a scholar of Mormonism who has devoted countless hours to trying to sort out this whole process of how something gains authority. Because, when you study religion, the idea is that if someone is in a position of authority, then they can speak normatively, right? Even if it's not considered doctrine, it has weight, and that weight has consequences whether or not it's doctrinal. So I'm wondering, the recent example with the race denouncement on the website where the church issued a statement, is that doctrine? I mean, where's the doctrine about race? Where's it officially? I mean, doesn't it have to be put in D&C to be doctrine? I mean, that's what the official process says happens at the end, but I don't know that there's been anything put in there recently.
Yeah, I would say there is no doctrine about race other than it's not an issue.
But it's just because they've said it more recently, so they could say anything at any time and then change. And
that is right.
Change it the next day, and that would be okay.
Yes, the prophet is. The prophet is speaking truth when his mouth is moving.
Okay.
And it can be in the Doctrine and Covenants and be declared as non-doctrinal, as we saw when Gordon B. Hinckley was asked about polygamy, and he said polygamy was not doctrinal.
Yeah.
So we're at a point where anything can be anything.
Yeah. Makes it really difficult to study, just so you know. Just putting that out.
Welcome to our world, Rosemary.
I feel your pain.
We're out of time. I'd like to just invite you. The Orem Institute of Religion is sponsoring a social this evening, a reception, and that will run from 5:30 to 6:45 over at the Institute. And then at 7 p.m., we will be doing the annual Eugene England lecture, which Patrick Mason will be delivering. Blessed are the peacemakers toward a Mormon theology and ethic of peace. So let's give one more round of applause to our, that'll be here. Yeah, so there, here. Thank you, John.